An alien girl with no future. Until a human pilot changed everything. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The Veteran Labor Registry on Selam Station had a waiting list that currently held 417 names, which meant that the probability of Lyra getting a work assignment through the standard channel before her temporary residential status expired in 31 days was a number she had calculated and recalculated until the calculating itself had become a form of the specific anxiety that produced no useful outcome. 417 names. 31 days. The math did not produce a result that improved with repetition. She was 22 years old, veteran species, with the copper-scaled skin and amber eyes that her people carried and which on Selam Station marked her immediately as a species that the station's labor registry had not fully integrated. The veteran skill classification system was in the process of being mapped to the station's standard employment framework, which had been in the process for 14 months, which was the kind of institutional timeline that was accurate and useless. Simultaneously, she had arrived on Selam Station with a work authorization application, a set of skills that the veteran technical classification system rated highly, and the specific confidence of someone who had planned carefully and had not fully accounted for the gap between planning and the reality of systems that did not recognize what she was. The skills were in navigation and spatial systems. Specifically, she had been a navigation trainee on a veteran freight vessel for 18 months before the vessel's operational contract had been terminated in the Drakri border pressure situation that had rippled through veteran commercial shipping for the last 2 years. She could read spatial charts with the precision of someone who had been doing it since she was 16, calculate fold space entry vectors by hand when the automated systems required verification, and manage a navigation console under pressure with the specific quality of someone who had been trained by people who did not accept approximations. These were real skills. The Selam Station Labor Registry's framework, which had been built around Terran and Quillari technical classifications primarily, did not have a category that mapped to them cleanly. She was sitting on the bench outside the labor registry office at 0800 on a Tuesday morning, not because the office opened until 0900 but because arriving early was a habit she had not been able to break even in circumstances where it produced nothing except an extra hour of sitting, when the man sat down at the other end of the bench. He had the specific quality of someone who had also arrived early and was also waiting for something, but whose version of waiting was more relaxed than hers, coffee in one hand, looking at a comm device with the unhurried attention of someone going through information rather than absorbing something urgent. He was human, perhaps 32 or 33, with dark hair and the particular build of someone who had been in practical physical work long enough for the build to be functional rather than cultivated. He was wearing a flight suit that had the specific lived-in quality of clothing that was used seriously rather than worn for presentation, with a Terran Frontier pilot's designation visible on the shoulder, not a military designation, the civilian freight and transport variant. They sat at opposite ends of the bench in the corridor outside the labor registry for 40 minutes without speaking, which was the natural default of two strangers waiting in the same place, and then he said, without looking up from his device, "Registry doesn't open for another 20 minutes. "I know," she said. "Came early anyway," he said. "Habit," she said. He looked up from the device at that. Not intrusively, with the specific attention of someone who had heard something in a tone that was worth hearing and was registering it. "Veteran," he said. "Yes," she said. "Lyra." "Dax," he said. "I have a licensing renewal that needs a registry stamp." "You." "Work authorization," she said. "I'm on the waiting list." He looked at the registry door. 417 names currently, he said. "I heard the number from someone last week. That's a significant queue." "Yes," she said. "It is." "What's the authorization for?" he said. Not intrusively, conversationally, in the way of someone filling a waiting period with genuine rather than performed interest. "Navigation and spatial systems," she said. "I was a navigation trainee on a veteran freight vessel. 18 months. He looked at her now with a different quality of attention. "Spatial chart reading," he said. "And fold space vector calculation," she said. "Manual and automated. Navigation console management under pressure." She had said this before several times to several people at various registry windows, and it had produced several variants of the same response, which was that the classification was being reviewed and the waiting list was current and her temporary status would be maintained until a determination was reached. She said it now to this person on this bench outside this registry office with the specific flatness of someone who has said accurate things enough times in contexts where they did not produce the result they should have produced. Dax was quiet for a moment. He was looking at his comm device but not at what was on it, the specific quality of someone who was thinking about something rather than reading something. The certification pathway for Veteran Navigation Credentials to Terran Equivalent took 14 months to develop and has been sitting in the registry's pending framework for 3 months since, he said. I know this because I was on the Terran Frontier Pilots Association's classification committee when it was being processed. It's complete. The framework just hasn't been formally implemented yet because the registry needs a senior authorization to activate a new classification category, and the senior authorization has been on administrative leave since the framework was submitted. Lyra looked at him. 3 months, she said. The framework exists, he said. It just hasn't been activated. He paused. Your skills would map cleanly to the Terran Navigation Specialist classification under the framework. If the framework were activated, your application would process in the standard timeline rather than the waiting list. The framework hasn't been activated, she said. No, he said. But the Frontier Pilots Association has standing to request expedited activation for frameworks that affect operational staffing needs. He looked at her. Which this does. Navigation specialists with fold space vector calculation experience are genuinely undersupplied on Selim Station's freight corridor. I know this because it's my problem professionally. Lyra sat with this information and tried to understand what she was receiving. She had been on Selim Station for 3 months. She had been navigating the labor registry system for 3 months with the systematic persistence of someone who had planned carefully and had learned that careful planning and institutional systems were not always well matched. She had been sitting on this bench for 40 minutes waiting for an office that would tell her the same thing it had told her for 3 months. And she was now receiving information from a stranger in a flight suit who apparently knew the classification framework's implementation status from personal professional involvement. Why are you telling me this? She said. Not suspiciously, with the directness of someone who had learned that understanding the reason for information was as important as the information itself. Because you have a skill set that is genuinely needed, Dax said. And you have been told for 3 months that the system cannot use it, which is inaccurate. The system can use it. The system has just not finished the process of being able to say so officially. He paused. And because I am on this bench at 0800 for a licensing renewal that takes 15 minutes, and the expedited activation request takes about the same amount of time to file, and I have the standing to file it, and it seems like a waste not to. The registry opened at 0900. Dax filed his licensing renewal in 11 minutes. He filed the expedited activation request for the Veteran Navigation Classification Framework in 17 minutes. The registry official who received the request looked at it, looked at his Frontier Pilots Association credentials, and processed it with the specific efficiency of a system responding to a request from an entity that had standing to make it. The activation timeline, the official said, would be 48 to 72 hours. Lyra sat at the registry window for her regular status check and received, for the first time in 3 months, a different answer than the waiting list. The official noted that her application was directly relevant to the pending classification framework and that upon activation her credentials would be processed in the standard 10-day timeline. She walked out of the registry at 0945 with the specific quality of someone who has been managing a situation for long enough that its resolution had not yet fully registered as real. Dax was in the corridor. 48 to 72 hours, she said. Probably closer to 48, he said. The senior authorization function was reassigned while the leave continues. The new person has been clearing the queue. You knew that too, she said. I checked before I filed, he said. It seemed relevant to whether filing now was worth doing. She looked at him with the copper-scaled directness of someone who had been processing an improbable morning and was arriving at the assessment of what it meant. You checked the administrative status of the authorization function before filing an expedited request on behalf of someone you met 40 minutes ago on a bench, she said. If the activation was going to take 3 months regardless of the filing would have been an inefficient use of both our time, he said. It wasn't. You are a very thorough person, she said. It's useful in navigation work, he said. You can't approximate in fold space. The math has to be right. She looked at him. You're a pilot, she said. Freight and transport, he said. The Frontier Pilot's license covers both. You calculate fold space vectors, she said. Manual verification when the automated systems flag uncertainty, he said. Which is less often than it should be and more often than everyone prefers. She had been a navigation trainee for 18 months on a veteran freight vessel that had calculated fold space vectors in the Drackery border zone under conditions that the automated systems had found genuinely uncertain with some regularity, and she had done it by hand with the precision of someone trained by people who did not accept approximations, and she was looking at a human pilot who had just described the same practice in different words. Where are you posted? She said. Selim Station Freight Corridor, he said. The Outer Run. Sector 7 to 12. Sector 7 to 12 has a navigation specialist shortage, she said. Yes, he said. I mentioned that. You mentioned it as context for the expedited request, she said. You did not mention it as an employment context. You don't have your authorization yet, he said. I will in 48 hours, she said. He looked at her with the direct quality of someone who was receiving information and processing it accurately. The Frontier Pilots Association has 3 freight vessels on the Outer Run with open navigation specialist positions, he said. The vessels are crew-matched. They need someone whose vector calculation is reliable under pressure in the Sector 7 to 12 environmental conditions, which include significant magnetic variance zones. I know magnetic variance zones, Lyra said. I worked the Drackery border zone for 18 months. The Drackery border zone magnetic variance is significantly higher than Sector 7 to 12, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He was quiet for a moment. In 48 hours, when the classification framework activates, your authorization will process in the standard 10-day timeline, he said. After that, the Frontier Pilots Association's navigation specialist positions are open through the standard application. The standard application, she said. Which I can walk you through, he said. If the system is unfamiliar. Lyra looked at the human pilot who had sat on a bench and learned her skill set and filed an expedited request with standing he had available and checked the administrative status beforehand so the filing would not be wasted, and was now describing 3 open positions that her skills mapped directly to in the same corridor where he worked, all while framing it as standard process information provided to someone navigating an unfamiliar system. Dax, she said. Yes, he said. Are you this thorough with everyone on benches at 0800, she said. He considered this. I am thorough with problems that have solutions, he said. You had a problem that had a solution. The solution required knowing specific information and having specific standing. I had both. He paused. That's not thorough. That's just using what's available. She thought about 417 names in 31 days and the math that did not improve with repetition, and an office that opened at 0900 in the 40 minutes that had produced an outcome that the 3 months before them had not, and she thought about what it meant that the outcome had come from a bench and a flight suit and someone who checked administrative status before filing because it seemed relevant to whether the filing was worth doing. The application, she said. For the navigation specialist positions. Yes, he said. Walk me through it, she said. He walked her through it. They did it over coffee at the station's corridor vendor. His second coffee, her first, which he bought because he was at the vendor already and asking, seemed efficient. And it took 40 minutes because the Frontier Pilots Association's application system had its own specific architecture that was not intuitive if you had not navigated it before, and he knew it thoroughly because of course he did. She completed the application with the precision of someone who had been filling out applications for 3 months and had become very good at the mechanics of them, and she submitted it at 1,045 hours. The classification framework activated at 1,130 hours on the following day, which was 37 hours rather than 48. The senior authorization function, as Dax had indicated, was clearing the queue efficiently. Her authorization processed in 9 days rather than 10. The Frontier Pilots Association's review of her navigation specialist application took 4 days. On the 4th day she received a communication from the association's crewing office noting that her veteran navigation credentials, validated against the now active Terran equivalent classification, demonstrated the specific skill set required for the Sector 7 to 12 Outer Run, with particular reference to her 18 months in the Drackery border zone magnetic variance conditions. They offered her a position on a vessel called the Meridian, which was the 3rd freight vessel on the Outer Run. She reported to the Meridian's docking bay at 0700 on her start date. The vessel was a mid-size freight carrier, functional and well-maintained in the way of ships that were used seriously, with a crew of 7 and a navigation console that she assessed in approximately 4 minutes as well configured and recently updated. The captain briefed her on the Sector 7 to 12 routes with the efficiency of someone who expected competence and was checking to confirm it rather than explaining fundamentals. She confirmed the competence in the way she always confirmed things, which was by demonstrating it accurately. The Meridian's pilot was Dax. She discovered this when the captain introduced her to the flight crew and Dax was standing in the flight deck with the same unhurried directness he had brought to the bench and the coffee and the application system. He looked at her with the same expression he had worn when she had said the Drackery border zone magnetic variance was higher than Sector 7 to 12, which was the expression of someone receiving information that confirmed a calculation. The Meridian, she said. Third vessel on the outer run, he said. I did mention there were 3 positions. You didn't mention which vessel you piloted, she said. You didn't ask, he said. She thought about 48 hours and the application and the coffee and the bench and the 417 names in 31 days and the math that did not improve with repetition and the calculation that had now produced a completely different result than any repetition of the original inputs had suggested was possible. No, she said. I didn't. The Meridian's first sector 7 to 12 run departed at 0900. Lyra was at the navigation console and Dax was at the flight controls and the sector's magnetic variance was exactly as she had calculated from the route documentation, and the fold space entry vector she calculated by hand for the first jump matched the automated system's calculation to 5 decimal places, which the automated system noted as confirmed and which Dax noted from the pilot's seat without commenting on it, which was the kind of acknowledgement that said more than a comment would. They ran the outer corridor for 4 months before she told him that the specific quality he had demonstrated on the bench at 0800 on a Tuesday, the checking, the filing, the coffee, the application, had required her to substantially revise a calculation she had been running since she arrived on Selim Station, which was the calculation about what was possible in the next 31 days. He said he was glad the calculation had revised. She said the revised calculation was significantly more interesting than the original. He said that was generally what happened when you applied accurate information to a problem that had been running on incomplete inputs. She said that was a very thorough way of putting it. He said thoroughness was useful in navigation work. She said she was beginning to understand that. The outer corridor sector 7 to 12 ran with 17 jumps, and they had done it 4 times, and she knew every fold space entry vector and every magnetic variance zone and every point in the route where the automated system's calculation required manual verification. And she had calculated every one of them to 5 decimal places, and not once in 4 months had the confirmation come back as anything other than confirmed. This was, she had decided, the most accurate accounting of what had changed since the bench at 0800 on a Tuesday, which was that the math had started working. It turned out that was the most significant change of all.